Good evening, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first big lecture of our season. Those who come to me not for the first year, I hope you appreciated the beautiful house in Flamancaria, soft chairs, and most importantly, what inspires me, this giant picture, which will please us all evening. Moreover, there are a lot of unique illustrations today. Today we are talking about Nubia, both the Egyptian and the one on the territory of modern Sudan. This is a premier lecture. There will be a lot of absolutely unique material, and this story, in my opinion, is as relevant as possible, including because quite recently there was sad news that in the context of political events unfolding in Sudan, the National Archaeological Museum in Khartoum became the capital of the country. And so today, when I will show you a lot of amazing masterpieces, absolutely amazing, in some cases I will not be able to tell you whether these monuments are alive now or not, because the director of the Sudanese Museum and the entire management team fled to the Netherlands in the process of what is happening there now, and what will remain by the time when clear political events take place. It will be very, very difficult to say. I traditionally ask you to turn off your mobile phones if you have not already done so. And in the next few hours, the golden sands of Nubia are waiting for us with you. In the winter of 1834, an Italian adventurer and traveller, once a former soldier and now a servant of his own generosity, Giuseppe Ferlini, was here. Here, on the golden sands, is the ancient kingdom of Meroe, which was a legend throughout the ancient world. Nearby, Nubia was breaking its third threshold. Here once, the most amazing events took place. And here, as it should be, you could feel that very tropical Africa, which in Egypt itself probably can be felt only south of Aswan. Not Photoshop, but such absolutely golden sand and small pyramids of the kingdom of Meroe, which on the one hand were built, of course, in the Egyptian style, on the other hand had a slightly different, as you noticed, shape, and never reached the heights of their Egyptian sisters. Here in the necropolis of the great kingdom of Meroe, Ferlini starts looking for banal gold. Due to the fact that it was hot, there was a hurry, the workers were ready to do everything that he wanted from them for the miserable money that they paid. So he did not explore the pyramids. He, starting from the top, simply tore them down to the base in order to find burial chambers, some hidden treasures, and find what he wanted. The portrait of this person, which is difficult to call well, but anyway, due to the fact that he began to publish in Europe the first stories that there, far away beyond Egypt, in a distant kingdom, there is also a pyramid, there are also treasures, there is also a great ancient culture. The first engravings, the first sketches appeared, and this is how the pyramid of a lady who was called Amani Shakato looked like. And I did not accidentally say the word lady, because there was no European analogue to her title. She was Kandaka. Kandaka in the ancient kingdom of Meroe is the great mother of the king, a living goddess, a woman who rules the state, a woman with whom the king agrees on all his political decisions. As in Egypt, the pyramid of Meroe, to the very structure of the tower, adjoined a small tomb-like temple. Here you see it in the same way, with reliefs, with biographies, with stories. And to this pyramid, approaching it in almost completely preserved form in Berlin, he makes one of his most famous discoveries: several dozen bracelets, gold rings, pendants, amulets, everything that once adorned the great Kandaka. Later he will collect this entire collection, and it will be very profitable to sell the stolen treasures in Europe, and they will be legally, for honest money, divided in half, bought by the Egyptian Museum in Berlin and the Museum of Archaeology in Munich. On the left in front of you is one of the bracelets of Amani Shokuto. This is an amazing work of Mero masters, and I do not accidentally start my today's story about Nubia with these things. Look how much Egypt is here, but how much Nubia is here too, because all my many thousand years of studying this history, this country somewhere competed with Egypt, somewhere obeyed, somewhere was inspired by the art of its elder brother, or rather by the Egyptian elder sister. After all, both lands, the Egyptians thought, as a feminine beginning. But on the other hand, every time in works of art and monuments and the legacy, Nubian masters added something of their own in terms of form, in terms of symbolism, in terms of colour. And here is this golden bracelet, partially preserved its incrustation. In the centre is a huge figure of the four-winged goddess Mut, patroness of the power of the kings. For in the Nubian lands, the Egyptian gods found their new second homeland. And next to the traditional Egyptian images of water lilies, the image of the goddess Mut in the Aegis, in such wide earrings as in the windows looking out of the temple. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of Nubian ornamentalism, which is brighter than the Egyptian one, which is more elaborate than the Egyptian one, which, let's be honest, is rougher than the Egyptian one. But anyway, these fantastic monuments, which were once jewellery, which the great Kandaka wore, were seen by Europe. This is a fragment of an exhibition from Munich, and I think that all of you who love Egypt involuntarily will still guess the Egyptian features in these objects. Another bracelet with the great goddesses' mothers. The goddess mother traditionally was very revered in Nubia because it is the most important distinguishing feature of religious cultures of ancient Africa. This is the matriarchate. This is the cult of the goddess mother. Few people know the small figure on the right, the god Upauta, the wolf opening the way, in front of which is a sacred cobra. It looks more like a hoofed animal. Look at the shape of the ankh on top. There was never such a shape in Egypt, but the Nubian forms, despite the fact that the Egyptian originals will be guessed, they will still have their own reading. On the left there is a magnificent pendant. This is an earring with a cobra, which is crowned with the head of the god Amun, who also found in Nubia one of the places of his reverence. In Nubia, the great Amun Favansky becomes probably one of the most important forms of the creator god. Only anthropomorphic, with a human face. It is very rarely depicted in Nubia. Here, most often, Amun will appear with the head of Oven, and here is the pendant of Egida, Oven, a huge wide necklace of moustache, the horns of Oven, and the traditional shuti, the crown of two stylized falcon feathers, which Amun brought with him to Nubia from Egypt. Behind me now is the first publication of the Treasures of Berlin, and for this set of amazing things, the architectural monument was destroyed. And then, after the history of Berlin began to be popular in Europe, a huge number of adventurers and then archaeologists found themselves on the shores of the White and Blue Nile, on the shores of the great river Adbar, on the shores of those rivers which, merging, became the Nile, which then came to Egypt. Two more wonderful items from the collection of treasures of the Queen of Kandaki, Amunishakito, and here again Amun, the patron of Nubia, supporting the enemies, and the goddess mother, the goddess Amun. Here, on the one hand, there is the absolute Egyptian iconography, and we must immediately realise that Nubian culture is not so epigraphic as that of Egypt. The inscriptions here are much less, and so we will often have to guess by Egyptian prototypes who's depicted before us. And here she is, the great Kandaka. She's in the centre, and behind her is the goddess of war, and in front of her is the deity that is depicted in the complete Egyptian canon, but which was not in Egypt, This is the lion-headed Apidamak, the god of the great kingdom, and she, Kandaka, appears here before these deities not by chance. In ancient Roman sources, there is a legend about a woman who was blind in one eye because she once lost one eye in a battle. And this woman, the great Kandaka of the kingdom of Meroe, managed to lead the troops into battle in such a way that she stopped the troops of the Roman Empire and signed a treaty with them on her terms. Here is such an absolutely stunning person, and in this frame it is specifically highlighted what was left of her once preserved pyramids from her monument, which took an honourable and significant place among other pyramids in the necropolis of the kingdom of Meroe. Yes, of course, since the beginning of the 20th century, archaeologists came there. First American and traditionally American scientists worked here under the guidance of the great Egyptologist, archaeologist, researcher not only probably of Egypt, but of the whole of the Indian Valley. I mean, of course, George Reisner. But those scientists who came here in the first decade of the 20th century did not treat monuments with respect, but in some sense they were no different from Berlin, because most of the most incredible treasures that we will see today, they took to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And when on the website of the Boston Museum there is an indication that these things were obtained as a result of the section of archaeological monuments that were inaugurated by the government of Sudan, we understand that this is northern Sudan, that northern Sudan was quickly occupied by England. People just showed what they wanted to take from the new excavation, and the Sudanese colonial government put a visa for this. Later, German scientists, first of all Friedrich Hinze, they were engaged in the restoration and reconstruction of what was lost. And this is what you see, a restored pylon of the late temple of Kandaki Amanitore. Fragments only preserved the true layout, which was decorated with the richest painted reliefs, as in Egypt all this was coloured. But at least this architectural form, it is preserved to this day. Very often, when a person begins to get involved in the heritage of the civilization of the Nile Valley, he goes only to Egypt, and Nubia is such an Egyptian sister who remained in the shadows. In fact, this is not entirely fair, because the cultural heritage of Nubia, it was born a little later on the banks of the Nile than the heritage of the Egyptian land. And here, in the area of the third threshold of the Nile, look what an incredible African nature. There is a place next to which this rock rises. This is Wadi Sabu. And there, in Wadi Sabu, amazing images of the first petroglyphs have been preserved on the rock. This is the turn of the 6th and 5th millennia BC. For a long time, until the moment when Egypt will not become Egypt, when there will not be an era of the ancient kingdom in Egypt. That is, we're talking about the 27th century BC. Nubia will develop quite independently. But despite all the confrontation between Egypt and Nubia in the future, the peoples were very close, the cultures were very similar, and many symbolic elements of Nubian art, ceremonial crowns, clothes, almost all the symbolism and insignia of the Nubian kings. It was very close to what we know by the image of the Egyptian pharaohs. Of course, the main source of life in Nubia is the Nile, as well as in Egypt. And here you see boats sailing along the river. Boats are absolutely wonderful. These are ritual boats during the holiday. They have sacred naos and cabins where the images of the gods are hidden. I'll show you closer. And looking at these simple graffiti on the rocks in Addis Ababa, this is the ancient Nubia, the turn of the 5th and 4th millennia BC. Nubia is incredibly rich, and therefore traditionally this land is rich in cattle, rich in tropical plants. And there, next to these graffiti, there are abundant cloud herds. cows that is such an incredible wealth, filled with life, and which is associated with Nubia. It is known to us from the most distant eras, comparable to the slow birth of the pharaohs in the north. The nature, perhaps, is only different. This is the third threshold of the Nile. This is the Ombos, and here it is, the threshold of the Nile, these rocky, huge ridges, which were a very big obstacle for trading, for ships. Usually around the thresholds were made special bypasses, either channels or zones where ships were dragged. I'll tell you about it a little later. Here is quartz white sand. Here is a very bright tropical African nature. And usually it was the thresholds of the Nile that became the place where, one way or another, the first settlements appeared. Because someone swam along the Nile to trade, and someone else sat on the threshold, began to build there the first fortresses in order to control trade flows and take tribute. We must perfectly understand with you that it was in all these places throughout the 3rd, 2nd, 1st millennium BC, all these incredible, luxurious goods of Africa, gold, black wood, stones, ostrich feathers, all this went there to the north, to the kingdom of the pharaohs. So the cities that were here on the territory of today's Sudan, they were very, very rich. This is already Egypt. This is the Nile and Aswan, and I really want you to, in parallel to my story, put together a picture, such a panorama, how different the great river looks in different parts of its course. Here are the granite rocks of the first threshold, which is located near Aswan, and there, far away on these ridges of yellow sand, is the great Aswan necropolis, Kubit al-Hawa. So let's take a minute to look at the map. On top we have Egypt. You see how the border crosses between the ancient territories of the countries here in the Aswan region. I will now show you more closely not only our beautiful murderers but also the cities. So the red dot at the top is Cairo, then the turquoise dot in the south of Egypt is the Great Epiphany. Of course, we will be there many times today. The purple dot, which is known by absolutely everyone, even those who are not very involved in ancient Egypt, is Abu Simbel, the great rock temples of the second RMSS, and in fact the current political border of Egypt. Just south of Abu Simbel is the border with Sudan, and finally in the very south there are two orange and purple dots. The orange dot is the great kingdom of Napa, the centre of political and cultural life of Nubia from the 8th to the 7th centuries BC. And finally, the lowest purple dot is the kingdom of Nero, where we started our movement today. Please note that the black dots show the border of the Egyptian influence, the so-called Egyptian Empire, approximately from the 14th to the 13th century BC, and the red dots show the power of the famous 25th dynasty of the Black Pharaohs, the pharaohs who came from Nubia, who captured the whole of Egypt for 72 years in the era when it was weak, and for these decades proclaimed their own kingdom. In the Egyptian texts, Nubia is most often called Kush. This is a very common name of this country, which appeared in the 2nd millennium BC, and literally, when the Egyptian king mentions this land, he calls it Kush. Hesed, the despised Kush. Black Africa was one of the most important paradigms of the Egyptian royal power, and in the palace of the king Ramses III in Tel El Yahudi, this is the 12th century BC, including the throne hall, there were such faience plates, which among the captives of other nations showed the Nubians. In fact, the Nubians must be obliged to Ramses III, because due to the fact that the Egyptian artist was always very precise, this collection of small plates preserved the gallery of the costume in the colour of the Nubian of that time. Therefore, white linen, as in Egypt, a lot of embroidery, red carrying fabrics, special red paste, which covered wigs or their own hair, rich and elaborate decorations, and necessarily tattoos like the Nubians. The Nubians also loved tattoos, which again forbade the Egyptians and showed the Egyptians the alien nature of this people. I remind you that in the classical Egypt of the pharaohs, there was a representation of the so-called four races. The Egyptians considered themselves the red race, the black race is Cush, the yellow race is Tehenu, this is Libya, and the white race is Syria, Lebanon, Greece, and all that is to the north is the fourth white race. What is Nubia rich in? Very, very much. And often looking at the canonical, famous, legendary, ancient Egyptian monuments, we do not remember that these monuments Egypt owes to its southern sister. Far south of present-day Egypt, about 200 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, there is a famous stone quarry, Toshka, the frame on the right. These are the same stone quarries from which the greenish diorite was hardly mined, which already in the era of the Great Pyramids was considered the best sacred stone for royal statues. The greenish black shade of this stone was associated with the paradigms of Egyptian art with the colour of immortality. And everyone, of course, perfectly recognised the cult statue of King Hafra from his late temple in Giza, Cairo Egyptian Museum, the famous falcon core, his heavenly prototype, the head of the royal family in Egypt, protects the back of the head and protects its official and ceremonial headdress, the name's handkerchief. The statue of Hafra, like many other monuments that were found in the pre-pyramid temples of Giza, was mined here in Toshka. And then on the slabs, imagine this work. These stone mounds swam up north to Egypt, to Memphis, so that there, already roughly processed in the quarry, on the spot, the highest and most experienced royal artists brought what's called to mind and made the masterpiece that admires us today. When we see the golden mask of Tutankhamun, which is still in the old museum in Tahrir Square, but will soon go to Giza, to the new National Museum, we must also remember Nubia. After all, Nubia is the name itself, it is more Greek, but it comes from the ancient Egyptian Nub or Neb, gold, the land of gold. Almost all of the Egyptian gold is the Arabian desert, and these are the southern limits of the country itself, and a huge number of gold mines on the territory of the Nubian kingdom itself. We know from Egyptian sources how difficult it was for those doomed who worked on gold mines. In the 13th century BC, Tsar Seti I personally went to the gold mines, was horrified, saw a road that was covered with bones of people and donkeys, ordered to make a series of wells in order to have at least some water. These wells were salted about 40 years later, and his son Ramses II remade these wells so that criminals, and only criminals worked on gold mines, were sentenced to work on gold mines. But nevertheless, first of all, they are people, so that they at least reach these places, and so that their fate there was not as cruel as the fate of those who forever remain in the rocks of the Arabian desert. Egyptian gold always contains a small percentage of silver and a little copper. Moreover, since ancient times, Egyptian jewelers have learned to make shade gold. So there is yellow gold, there is red gold, there is green gold, and there is what Egypt calls white gold. This is electrum, this is natural or artificial alloy of gold and silver. Let's go back to Aswan, beautiful Egyptian feluccas. In ancient times, by the way, they were not there. This is a Venetian sail, and it came to Egypt already in the Middle Ages. And there in the rocks you see a large number of tombs, separate entrances. All this is a huge necropolis of Aswan, the era of the ancient and middle kingdoms. This is the necropolis of the city, which was located right on the Nile, on the great sacred island of Elephantine. And there, among these biographies, there is a completely amazing story. Many, of course, know, but I will still pay attention to it for a while. when at the very end of the ancient kingdom, in the 23rd century BC, the local mayor who ruled the island of Elephantine, who was called Kufor, his image at the entrance to the tomb on the right, he goes there many times with successful expeditions to the south. Otherwise, like troglodytes, he does not call the murderers at all. And the level of such neglect, anger towards people, it is huge. That is, at this moment, the Egyptians do not perceive them as people. He takes out gold from there. He takes out some precious gifts from there. And at this moment, the King Pepe II rules, the great Pepe the Great, who ascended to the throne with all the infants after the early death of his father. And his mother, Queen Ananas Mary II, became a great regent. An amazing monument of incredible quality, the Egyptian travertine, is kept in the United States. It is a masterpiece of the Brooklyn Museum. And in his autobiography, Kufor writes, as he once mentioned, that he knows among those gifts that he carries from another expedition to the troglodytes, he carries a dwarf pygmy. And then he quotes a letter of the young King Pepe II, written from the king's words, that the king's hat, this dwarf pygmy, is absolutely exotic, although it would seem Nubia is not so far away. So the king's heart, this dwarf pygmy, is more expensive than all the gold of Kush. And then follow detailed instructions how to keep an eye on this dwarf day and night, so that he does not fall overboard. It is quoted that what terrible punishments will be with those people who will be guilty if this dwarf does not reach Memphis, to the capital. And in this, on the one hand, pleasant text, which tells about the entertainment of the royal child, the most long-ruling king of Egypt, Pepe II was known in 1998. It was incredible just for the ancient world. On the one hand, it is the joy of the royal child, who's waiting for the child of Nubians, who will become his slave. And on the other hand, such a very gloomy, very tough context with which Egypt came to Nubia in the era of the construction of the great pyramids at Memphis. Even tougher relations between Egypt and Nubia began in the Middle Ages, that is approximately from the 21st to the 18th century BC. The fact is that at some point, Nubia, which was famous for its strong warriors, especially archers, Nubian archers, they even served in the Egyptian court. So Nubia began to create, at the moment when, after the collapse of the pyramid era, Egypt was weak, its own kingdom, which could resist the constant Egyptian invasions from the north. And then the great kingdom of Kerma appears, which I will tell you in more detail. And the reaction to the creation of a serious political opposition in the south is the action of the Tsar of the 12th dynasty. Before us is a very serious, very spectacular psychological portrait of the Tsar of Senusret III. The great Senusret III, Kakura, was one of the outstanding conquerors of Nubia. But due to the fact that the Tsar was not only a warrior, but also an intellectual, in Nubia, not only terrible blood flows through the sand, but also temples are created, fortresses are created, new elements of infrastructure are created, thanks to which Egypt can interact with the southern borders. On the right, if this portrait is kept in the British Museum, on the right is a stela of Senusret III from the city of the fortress of Semne. This monument is now kept in the Berlin Museum in Germany. I will read you the translation. Long live Kor, by divine birth, Tsar of Upper and Lower Egypt Kakura, to whom life is given forever. The year is 16, the third month of the season of sunrise. His Majesty created the southern border to the area of Hek. I made my border when I sailed to the south. Farther than my fathers, I increased what I got. It is I, the Tsar, who speaks and does. What my heart thinks is done by me. Ferocious to capture, decisive to successfully perform, not giving to sleep the case in his heart. thinking about the poor, not short for the enemy attacking him. Attacking when they attack him, silent when they are silent. Responding to the case, aware of what happened to him, for if you are silent after an attack, then it is strengthening the heart of the enemy, strengthening of the rebellious. Retreat is a weakness. Pressed on his border, this coward is real. For to listen to Kushita, it is to fall from the word, and to answer him, it is to make him retreat. When Kushita rebels against him, he always retreats, and when they retreat, then he falls into rage. There are no Egyptians who worship this retreat, because the youthful is grief. My majesty, I saw this retreat of the Cushites, and there is no truth in it. I captured their women, I brought their subjects, I went out to their wells, I beat their bulls, I tore their barley, I burned it. How does my father live for me? I said the truth, and there was no praise in what came out of my mouth. Further, as for any of my sons who will strengthen this border made by my majesty, he is my son, he was born for my majesty. The son is beautiful, following his father, strengthening the border for the sake of the one who gave birth to him. As for the one who will leave the border and will not fight for it, he is not my son. He was not born from me and not for me. And then my majesty ordered to make a statue of my majesty on the border of this established by my majesty, out of desire that you descendants were strong on it, that you fought for it. This is one of many thousands very tough texts, which, as it cannot be better, shows the attitude of the Egyptian kings on the one hand to the ever-rising southern neighbour, and on the other hand to the country where the wealth of the Egyptian court came from. First, let's take a look at one of the most, in my opinion, terrible monuments of Egyptian military propaganda, which is kept in the British Museum. This is the Egyptian Sphinx clawing claws of the captured Nubian prisoner. Very clearly on the face, in fact, his racial affiliation is shown. On the other hand, what I said at the very beginning, at Sanusurtiathre, a system of fortresses is being built. I note the red square of Buchan, which we will see now, and the zone of the threshold of Semna and Kuma. These are also two very famous fortresses. And so look at Mergisa, Dabanartia, Aksut, Shelfag, Uran Artia, and even more fewer fortresses that are not marked on this map. And here on the one hand there were military garrisons, and on the other hand gold flowed here, which either melted into rings or gold sand was poured into bags. Here was concentrated Egyptian production, including not only military production, not only what they bought, there was also a lot of trading. And these fortresses on the one hand, so they sent goods to the north. They were such a grid of fortifications which did not allow the Nubians to unexpectedly be in the court of the Egyptian pharaoh as part of their armies. But it is very interesting. We know that Sanusurtiathret also founded Jewish schools in these fortresses, which studied Nubia, studied Nile. In particular, here in Nubia, when the Nile passed the second threshold, the third threshold, they studied how the height of the rising Nile in Nubia corresponds to the later flow in Egypt. Because the insufficient flow of the Nile in Egypt is famine, the excessive flow of the Nile in Egypt is wild fertility. It is also famine. Accordingly, based on the data obtained in Nubia, there was a prediction of a good or bad flow to the northern part of the Nile Valley. A unique frame made in the late 1950s. This is the fortress of Buchan. And now let's think for a second that most of the Nubian fortresses lived to the middle of the 20th century and were destroyed by the Nile waters, which rose after the construction of the High Aswan Dam. If temples, tombs, some more famous monuments, less voluminous, could be moved to higher places, we will talk about it today, then all these fortresses went to the bottom of the Nile, and only small stone inclusions that were in each of such fortresses palace, temple, more or less in some cases, were transferred to the territory of either Egypt or Sudan. Buchan was one of the greatest fortresses of the 19th century before the new era. Evaluate the level of the fortifications for such an antiquity. Here is the outer wall. Inside the outer wall there were still processing fields. Here below is the Nile. That is, here is a direct exit to the Nile, control over the Nile. Underground sewage systems that consist of pots with a cast bottom, which was inserted into the pot, and thus underground the water supply of the fortress went. And where it went, no one really knew. And already in the centre there was a fortress of the fortress, that is, an additional, higher, more powerful fortification. Where was the temple? Where was the palace of the governor? Where was the military garrison? And we even know that for a good service they issued wooden tokens on which later the members of the garrison received a commission and some other elements of their wealth, that is, a payment for service. I really love the reconstruction of Jean-Claude Goulven, a wonderful French architect who deals with the ancient world. Very accurate, very scientific reconstruction of the Buchan fortress. Please note that the exits and entrances of the Buchan fortress are on the Nile side and in the desert. That is a fairly fortified, harsh city that could resist the murderers and control accordingly the flow of the Nile, where such a fortress was located. Another very interesting example I show you on the map, the threshold between the fortresses Semneh on the right and Kuma on the left. Here, one of the thresholds of the Nile, it allowed, in the literal sense of the word, to restore the ships, to collect tribute, to track the ships to the north, to Egypt. And here, no less majestic, and even Semneh, it is more steep in terms of fortifications, in terms of height and walls, and how it's all done. Such fortresses were built in the 3rd century BC, and then they were supported by subsequent kings of other eras. So who was Egypt so afraid of in the Middle Kingdom? These shots, probably, not many have seen. Today, by the way, there will be a lot of names which are alien to the ear of an Egyptologist. So it happened. This is the great kingdom of Thermo. This is a state that was a contemporary of the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. That is, it is the 19th and 18th centuries BC. This is the centre of the city. And what you see in front of you is the great Western Dafufa. Dafufa is an artificial ritual mountain made of brick and stone at a height of 20 metres. This is the platform on which Kushite gods live. And then at the foot of Dafufa there was a fairly large city. Next to the most various temples is the Western Dafufa. At some distance was the Eastern Dafufa. It is smaller. Nearby was a necropolis of the early Kushite rulers of this time. Such a wonderful picture. It is made just from the height of Dafufa, and here you see all the wealth of the Nile Valley, and what is now for many years is being explored by French and German archaeologists in Thermo. This is a very large archaeological centre. There's even a museum there which we will look at today. And this is the main ritual, cultural, economic, political centre of Nubia. Accordingly, the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, it was those people who lived here that the 3rd CNSR was so afraid of that Egypt did not want people to come from here to the north. In the 16th century BC, together with the beginning of the new kingdom, together with the appearance of great rulers who built, in fact, the Egyptian empire, the exploration of Nubia and the settlement of Nubia became the main business of the Egyptian kings. On the left is Thutmose III, the great Menhepero, who over the years of his reign conquered more than 300 foreign cities. With Thutmose III, Nubia was settled to the 4th threshold of the Nile. With him and his predecessors, the great Kerma fell, and there, a little north of Great Dafufa, the Egyptians immediately founded their own city. The city is founded where something had been before. This is not only in the Egyptian tradition, but also in human history. The city of Penups, which arose from the northern Kerma, was the seal of the Egyptian king over the Nubian independence. Due to the fact that the events in Nubia happened sometimes very quickly, and the Nubians were warlike, and in those years, as you know, the mail flowed along the river quite slowly, it was necessary to come up with ways to quickly cross the thresholds. This is what the granite rocks on the first threshold of the Nile look like. This is a little south of Aswan. This is the Nile. This is not Photoshop. This is not an exaggeration. There are blue waters, white sand, and red granite. Moreover, when the sun sets, you look at the river and at the thresholds as if diamonds were scattered. Because the Nile blurs the granite and leaves the ice, it is light, and the ice, with such a fan, such a crust, it covers the sandy thresholds. When the sun sets, these diamond thresholds on the borders of Egypt make Nubia incredibly beautiful. As a result, with Thutmose III and his uncle Thutmose I, a special system of crossing the thresholds is made. Think about it. This is a very simple and ingenious solution. On the side of the threshold, a road is made, more or less flat. Further along the edges, this road is limited by walls about 60 centimetres high, stone, clay, whatever is there. Then this road is filled with liquid Nile clay, and ships roll over this road with great speed through the threshold. This path of Menapera, as it was called, has come to this day. And imagine that there are still hundreds of bare men's feet from those men who pulled these ships so that the Egyptian army on the oars, of course, could not cross the Thutmose because the river flow turned out to be in Nubia and subordinated Nubia to self-control. In those fortresses that were founded by the Nusarts, Thutmose built his temples. This is a fragment of the sanctuary of the Buchan Temple, which was built with Thutmose III in the 15th century BC, when the Buchan fortress was disassembled in the years when these lands were to be flooded with Nile water. The Buchan temple was moved to the territory of Khartoum in the National Museum. Is it still there or not? We don't know. We'll find out in 2 years, not earlier. Look at this amazing Egyptian cannon. It was made by the best Favand masters. The polychrome colour here has been preserved perfectly from the 15th century BC. It was very important to preserve these temples, and they stand in Khartoum in these hangars under the roofs so that the damage to these monuments is not caused by wind or rain, which also, you know, does not happen in Sudan. On the one hand, this is Egyptian art. On the other hand, gradually Egypt begins to involve in its paradigm those gods, spirits, those elements of the Nubian worldview that flourished in these lands. On the left, there's relief with the image of Tsar Thutmose III. This is a relief from the Temple of Semneh. It was also moved. Look at the deity that touches him like a son. This is the embrace of a father and a son. And then the titles say that this is the first of the land of the bow. And the land of the bow is one of the Egyptian names of the upper Nubia. And this is a deity called Daedon. In ancient Egypt, you don't know such gods. By the way, Daedon is worshipped either completely in the anthropomorphic form or in the form of a huge white bird. This is the god of aromas, fragrance, and luxury. And according to legend from distant southern countries, a huge white bird Daedon flies to the territory of the temple of the god Ammon of Karnak, and from the way he waves his wings, incredible aromas of the south spread through the god's abode. This is the primordial deity of fertility, which was worshipped in this land. And also in the temple of Semneh, with Thutmose III, there are images of such a pious king. He is shown here in the image of Osiris. He is in his ceremonial boat. The image, by the way, is absolutely rare. And then, this is a good king. Osiris is the patron and saviour of this land. This is the son of Osiris III, who drowned her in blood, who was like many other Egyptian rulers later, worshipped and revered as a living deity on the territory of the temple complexes that arose in Nubia. The contemporary of Thutmose III, one of his first great viziers, a great official of Rafmer, whose tomb is located in the west of the fifth Sheikh Abdul Kuni, he ordered to capture, including the gifts that were brought to the Egyptian court from the south. And here, traditionally for Egypt, this is a cradle which holds goods, ostrich feathers, golden rings, the far left upper corner of ostrich eggs. These black blocks are black wood, insanely expensive. Recall for a moment the Egyptian collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Pushkin in Moscow. Now you should see carved images of Amenhotep and Renee, which are made of black wood. Here is the black wood which they made. Next, here are vessels with Nubian oils, red bags of precious stones, which Nubia was very rich with. In particular, the favourite Egyptian amethyst, the sacred stone Hismon. It was mined in Wadi al-Hudi. This is a special place in the Nubian desert. Elephant tusks, and even on purpose so that you don't think that this is something else. Around these tusks, the word Abu is repeated twice. Elephant tusks are elephant tusks, leopard skin, gold, gold, and again gold. This is what Nubia gave to Egypt at her own will or against it. Pushing the southern land was an absolutely familiar element of the royal house. In the era of the New Kingdom, which we are now talking about, that is from the 16th to the 11th century, before the new era, the element of the power of Egypt over the southern neighbour was transmitted by various monuments. A wonderful work, a collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, glass faience, gold. This is an Egyptian lion tearing the head of a Nubian. This, my friends, is a pen for a royal flycatcher. That is when Amenhotep III, or his wife, Queen Tea, or some courtiers drove away a fly during a feast, a flycatcher, which is usually made from a horse's tail, holding such a pen with an Egyptian lion that kills a Nubian. Such examples of very tough propaganda that poured out into the life of the royal house, into the world of luxury. There are actually a lot of them in the era of the New Kingdom. Let's go back to Nubia, again the third threshold of Nile, the tombos, and think about what monuments the Egyptians left in this land, in addition to the fortresses we have already talked about. Sometimes, these monuments are not only royal, and here in the tombos, on the rocks, which have been here since some crazy time, there are still steles. On one of such steles, the blue arrow shows which people left, specially appointed by the king to rule Nubia, the royal son of Cush. That's what the official position of the son of Cush sounds like, the position of a person who was an official of the king in the southern lands. Initially, at the very beginning of the reign of the 18th dynasty, apparently the king really appointed his son to this very important position. Then this position is ceremonial, and under each king, 1, 2, 3 royal sons of Cush are engaged in the organisation of all this complex military and economic logistics in the southern lands. The stela, which is on your right, and the portrait of this person was left in the 14th century before the new era by the royal son of Kushmiramosa, who was one of the most successful rulers of Nubia under the rule of the Egyptian king in the 14th century. All that gold and all that luxury that lived in the courtyard was achieved by Meramosa, whose sarcophagus is kept in the British Museum in London. The sarcophagus is absolutely amazing. It is one of the best monuments of the burial inventory of its kind. Here is a portrait, and the processing of granite is simply fantastic. And here on this stela, Meramosa himself stands. He holds his hands in the position of prayer before the royal names, Amenhotep, the ruler of Fivan, and the throne name of Amenhotep Ther Nebumatri Ra, the ruler of the truth. And down there, with their heads destroyed, the inhabitants of Cush Hesed are tied to the base of the royal name, the Nubians themselves, on the territory of which the stela was actually erected. We know about many royal sons of Cush, but we also know about many Egyptian architects who in Nubia, far from Egypt, created wonders. Look at this beauty. This beauty is comparable in proportion and in the quality of work with the Luxor temple. This is Solep. In ancient times this place was called Haimat, which shone in the truth. It is there from the sandstone the same great Egyptian architect Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, erects the first temples for his ruler, for Amenhotep III. The plan shows you that part of the temple, which again is very similar to the temple of the god Amun in Luxor, first a small monumental colonnade on top. There were huge columns, I'll show you now, in the shape of palms, palm-shaped capitals, because Nubia is still Africa. Then a series of open peristyle courtyards which rise and are connected by a system of ramps, then a luxurious closed column hall and practically unpreserved Holy of Holies. Haimat Solep is one of the most famous monuments of today's Sudan. It is clear that in the situation in which it is now, it is inaccessible. Before that, European intellectual tours, we will now see a part of Solep. Such giant columns stand at the entrance to the temple, despite the fact that it was very much disassembled in the 4th century of the new era for the construction of a local monastery. There are a lot of such dead monuments in Nubia, because Nubia very actively and very joyfully accepted early Christianity and used ancient monuments for the construction of cult complexes of the new religion. But even in this state, Solep, of course, makes an incredible impression. And these amazing proportional, so characteristic in their numerical values, columns for the epoch Menotep III, and these are bundles of papyrus buds which rise up. It was not easy for the Egyptians to come here, because in fact, if you remember the monuments of the Nile Valley, then the main building stone of Egypt is limestone. And the stronger the limestone, the closer it is to marbleized limestone, the easier it is to make a relief. Here is a sandstone. This is a sandstone that crumbles, and to make really thin reliefs, as required by Menotep III, it was very difficult here. Then, at one time, I had the honour of meeting an amazing Frenchman, Dr. Jean Leclerc. Jean Leclerc is a legend of French Egyptology. Jean Leclerc was also a patron and head of the expert council of the famous Franco-Italian Fund in Georgia. This is a very rich lady, for the money of which the Temple of Egypt in Nubia is being restored. And he told me very interesting things. That is, it is better not to reveal those parts of the basements of Salaba where there are reliefs, because the foundations are wet, and as soon as you open the volume of some relief from under the sand dries up and just crumbles from the sandstone about 1.5 centimeters of the surface, along with those reliefs that were left there in the 14th century BC. This is the problem of Nubia's archaeology, which thank God is practically absent in Egypt. In Sudan this is very problematic, but still I will show you something. This is the base of massive columns, and here, imagine how the locals reacted to this, what kind of fear it caused. Here is an image of the local cities. This is one of the Nubian fortresses, Narkib. That is in this oval, which is not a royal cartouche. You see, it has such convex parts. This is like a view of the fortress from above. These are fortress towers. This is a fortress, and here's a Nubian with a characteristic face, with features of the face characteristic for the Negroid race, with a golden ring in the ear. And here it is, all connected. It is conquered. It is at the base of the column of the temple of the Egyptian king. And such captive toponyms of the entire Nubian kingdom were covered by the lower part of the columns of the temple in Soleb, including even very remote, because if the right oval is Irem, this is the area between the third and the second threshold of the Nile. Then on the left in this oval is written Punt. Punt is the territory of Maron, Somalia and Eritrea. This is the same Punt where the Queen Hatshepsut carried Ladan, mere gold and all these incredible riches. Punt is also one of the conquered lands of the south, which are included in such mandatory royal lists. On the walls of the Temple of Soleb, a huge number of amazing reliefs, which are associated with the holiday of Sed of Amenhotep III. The holiday of Sed is the holiday of the revival of the life forces of the king, when all the negative that his physical body has accumulated is converted into a statue, which will later be the object of burial. The king reunites with the world of the gods, with the world of the ancestors. And here, in particular, is a very beautiful scene. Amenhotep III goes in a long, specific attire, typical for this holiday, and he offers a sacrifice to the cult statue of the god Khnum, the first in Elephantine, that is the god protector of the border of Egypt and Nubia. And behind the king everywhere there is the Queen Tea. Her figure here on the left is very clearly visible. It is here in Soleb that the programme on the deification of the living Amenhotep III, which, as we know, worshipped itself. I will show you now amazing things that are little known even among the Egyptologists. First, the cult statue is famous from the Luxor temple. That is, this is Amenhotep III in the image of the god Atum, in the image of the living god of the sun. He has already come to this Luxor temple, and there in Soleb, where this idea has only been developed and worshipped, he portrays himself as the lunar god Nebmatra. Amenhotep III in Soleb is the lunar god, the son of Amun-Ra. This is how he is depicted in the relief on the right. He has a massive crown of Modius on his head and a double image of the moon in the form of a serpent and in the form of a disc. And to his temple in Soleb in Haimat, Amenhotep III puts a completely fantastic alley of granite ovens. These are not sphinxes, these are ovens. You can see the full body of the animal with the hooves. This rune of the oven does not fall off it. And if the oven itself is Amun-Ra, then the figurine embalmed under his chin is the lunar god Nebmatra. This is Amenhotep III, who deified himself in his lifetime. These statues were valued in such a way that after many centuries, the Nubian kings, we will come to this later, were taken to another temple of their own, because they themselves could not repeat this. As a result, in the 19th century, conducting their research on Egypt and Nubia, the famous German archaeologist Karl Richard Lepsius brought several ovens, and this oven in the Berlin Museum. The horns of the solar disk and ears were restored in the 19th century. They were originally, apparently, made of cast gold and were inserted into the stone monument. In the 19th century, the Germans made a suitable reconstruction to imagine what such a monument looked like in the best years of the reign of Tsar Amenhotep III. And Apotheos Solibus, on the right, is Amenhotep III, like a living king. On the left is Amenhotep III, like a lunar god. They embrace each other like two parts of the same thing. Amenhotep III is the king of the sun, who was originally a great lunar lord, of course. And Queen Tea, the great royal wife, and the famous wife of Amenhotep III, did not stay in the country. And a separate temple was dedicated to her next to Solibus. This is the place that is now called Seda Inga in ancient times, Hut Thea, the abode of Thea. Unfortunately, there's only one column with the face of the goddess Hathor. And here, Thea was venerated in the image of the angry female sphinx which pierces the Nubian people. Of course, I can't help but show you her most famous portrait from the Berlin Museum. But here, my choice is not accidental. On this tiny monument, I will remind those who do not know that the height of the head from the neck to this place, that is without a high headdress, is 9.5 centimeters. She is depicted here as the deified queen, as the star Sirius. And this headdress, the star Sirius, shows her as a living goddess. It was the living goddess, Queen Thea, who was venerated here in Seda Inga. By the way, it's funny, in the early Christian times, when the temple was already destroyed, it was used, as always, for the construction of the monastery, and the place was called Thea. That is some kind of echo of the name of the queen, experienced it for many centuries in this Sudanese temple complex. Many will be surprised, but willingly built in Nubian Neton. This is the temple of Aton in Sesibe. Not only Amarna, not only Memphis, not only Karnak, not only all the cities of Egypt here in the south, where it was also necessary to prove the basis of the emergence of a new faith in the era of religious reform, a different complex is being built. This Sesibe has been preserved more or less well. Pay attention to how the modern Nubian cemetery, all you see on the horizon are graves. This is a self-capture of the land, a plot of land for necropolis, so it is easiest to capture the land. And in another Nubian place, which was called Kava, there's also a temple built in Neton, and initially Kava was called Hemet by Aton. Aton is found, and the funniest thing is that Nubia was not so strongly influenced by Egypt as its own cities. Years will pass. Somewhere in the middle of the first millennium, Aton will be forgotten, and there in Kava there will be a huge temple of Ammon, and the temple of Ammon in the house of Hemet by Aton. That is in principle impossible things, but in Nubia everything was simpler, and therefore, well, this name has already stuck to this place. Well, why change this name? Well, let's leave it as it was. Although the temple is already dedicated to Ammon, with whom Aton fought. In the royal monuments, the conquest of Nubia was reflected, including through absolute masterpieces. In the British Museum in London, this lion is kept. Initially this pair, red granite. Look what a fantastic work. He began to make these lions, Amenhotep III, for the Solebi complexes for one of the courtyards, did not finish, and his grandson Tutankhamun. And the names of Tutankhamun also cover the basis of this great inscription of this magnificent lion, which again depicts not just a lion, but Amenhotep III in the image of a lunar lion hunting at night. That is, this lunar connotation of the king is preserved here. In the tomb of Tutankhamun was found no less famous monument. This is the ritual shield of the king. And here Tutankhamun himself, in the image of a winged sphinx, he beats two Nubians, which, judging by their faces, are already lifeless. And what is most interesting, here these Nubians lie on such a substrate. This is the base of the sacrificial table. That is, they are the victims brought to the king of the Nubian gods. At the bottom of the table are 4 mountains. This is the designation of Hasud. This is an alien country. These mountains stand against the flat land of Egypt. Behind the royal sphinx, by the way, it is crowned according to the scheme of these crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Behind it is a large Apahala Behet. This is an Apahala, which additionally says that he is still alive, unlike those who he killed. Of course, the falcon choir, the chief of the royal power, a huge winged choir, another form of the choir in the form of a winged sun disk, and in the inscription 3 vertical columns in particular. It is said that this is a process of trampling, literally trampling the great ones. That is, it is not just some Nubians, but the rulers. These Uru, these are the great, these are the princes, as we would say now, some significant people. That is the land that is under the Egyptian power. From the epoch of Tutankhamun to our time came one very beautiful evidence. It is located in the Fives on the western shore in the necropolis of Konet Morai. This is the tomb of Mr. Amenhotep Hui, who was the royal son of Kusha under Tutankhamun. This portrait is absolutely wonderful. He has a bouquet in his right hand and a bouquet in his left hand, and he has a golden necklace of the glory of Shibu and golden bracelets. In fact, it is now coming out of the royal palace. It was awarded only by the king for his worthy accomplishments. And what are the worthy accomplishments of our ruler of the Nubian lands? Here it is. This is the most detailed, the most interesting image of the Nubian tribute. Moreover, it is not just a tribute brought by the Egyptians. Here are high-ranking Nubians who came to the court of the Egyptian king with their gifts, and accordingly, Mr. Amenhotep Hui, as the royal son of Kusha, he accepts them and presents them to the king. I will show you now in more detail because it needs to be examined. Well, first of all, look how interesting the Egyptian artist in the centre shows the representatives of different Nubian tribes. Strongly tanned and blue, just black, such ebony faces, such incredibly beautiful ebony faces on the territory of northern Sudan. This is a fairly common phenomenon. It is very important to emphasize that they are all dressed according to the Egyptian canon. They are dressed like very high-ranking Egyptian noblemen. In front of them, there is a Nubian princess of Kusha. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the 20th century, robbers tried to cut her face. It was simply destroyed. There is her face in the early copies. There is a princess, and in front of the princess, her messengers in the pose of prayer bow to the Egyptian king. At the same time, on their heads there are ostrich feathers as a sign of joy. And here everything is full of leopard skins, ostrich feathers, gold embroidered fabrics. Wealth is impossible here. And the main gift to the king, of course, is gold. Here one of the messengers carries golden rings, and above them the hieroglyph Nub. That is a lot of gold which is brought here. In another fragment of the scene, we continue to look at it. Here they carry precious stones. Pay attention to the surprisingly interesting different hairstyles of the Nubians, on their dyed hair, on their wigs. And here some other Nubian person, very significant, came on a chariot which is bound by bulls, or such bulls spotted carry a chariot. And there's also a big flock behind it, all in the best Egyptian taste, and Egypt did it very consciously. And when, let's say, the era of more or less peaceful relations, such eras where Egypt took to itself children of Kushite rulers, they were brought up in the courtyard by Egyptian noble ladies and widows. And imagine a child who came from his Kerma, saw the temple of god Amun in Karnak, saw the widows, smelled the Egyptian incense, looked at the Egyptian holidays, learned the Egyptian letter, was involved in this incredible, luxurious world. What does he do later? When he returns to his Kerma, which became Nubia, he establishes Egyptian order there because it is beautiful. This is what he got used to. This is what is called now soft policy of soft power. This soft policy of soft power gave such a result, which is now before you on this painting of the 14th century BC. Traditionally, in addition to gold and leather, in Egypt apparently, such mini zoos were very developed. Here is a giraffe, very rare for Egypt, which was brought to please the young king Tutankhamun. With this giraffe, there are two separate servants who serve this rare animal. We know that there were such amazing customers where rare animals lived, including from archaeological sources and from texts. Here they all came, and here our hero, the royal son of Kusha, comes with the most expensive gifts, and there in the kiosk sits young Tutankhamun. The image is poorly preserved, And he tells them about the gifts that we brought to these noble Nubian people. Uru en Kash. The yellow arrow shows gold, 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 gold. Closest to the king is gold, the desired precious metal of the southern neighbouring lands, the new era of military power and the construction of Egypt in Nubia began with the reign of the Ramesses in the 13th century BC. The throne statue of Ramesses the Great from the Turin Museum in front of you on the right. Following his father Seti I, these terrible stories that people die when they go to the golden rites, Ramesses one way or another, began to subjugate Nubia. Partly this subjugation was ritual, because at that time relations between the countries were good. Nubia was a banal colony, so to speak. But, for example, in the earliest temple of Ramesses in Abydos, there is such an image. This is a Nubian with a red haircut. Notice that his throat is intercepted by a ribbon that ends with the image of Shimei, the heraldic lily of Upper Egypt. That is, his breath depends on whether the king will pull the lily to the south or not. This is a direct indication of the gift of life. It is naturally connected, and this is what we have already seen in Solib, an oval that resembles a fortress, and here it is written Wawat. Wawat is one of the three large areas of Nubia. Wawat, Kush and Henat Hennefer, the three largest areas of Nubia under the Egyptian kings from the 14th to the 12th centuries BC. In Nubia, Ramesses II, following the will of his ancestors, builds fantastic temple complexes. This is not our topic today, but I will walk a little through them. Let me remind you of the Valley of Lions. The lion is from Sabua. Initially, the rock temple was built by Amenhotep III, and Ramesses supplemented it with courtyards, pylons, and this beautiful alley where the lying sphinxes in the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt are combined with the royal colossi. Inside this temple, which of course is moved to a higher place, there are various relief compositions, the most interesting ones. But let's see who's in front of us. To the right is Ramesses II. He exalts Kulanitsa and makes an offering to the gods. In Char, the god of the Libyan desert and the god of remote lands, is worshipped here. Ramesses II himself, the usurper of Ramesses, who's in the house of Amun, he worships himself, just as it was with Amenhotep III. The goddess Tefnut, the great goddess associated with the Libyan woman living in the Nubian desert, in Char's wife, and Nebet, the ritual patroness of Upper and Lower Egypt, that is, the gods of the south, and Ramesses himself, whom he worships here, taking this tradition of worship from the epoch of Amenhotep III. Another small temple, also moved to a higher place, is now in the island of New Calabria. This is the temple of Bait al-Wali, literally, by the way, a funny Arabic name, the house of the ruler, as they perceived it when they called these complexes. The facade is very simple. There are many military reliefs nearby, but there are amazing scenes inside. I will show only two. On the left, the goddess Anuket, the goddess of the island of Elephantine and the Nile's pure water, feeds Ramesses' breast, despite the fact that his face is beaten. Look at the tenderness, the reverence, and a very beautiful temple. On the right, from the same hall, the goddess Isida feeding Ramesses' breast. But this is not an ordinary Isida. Pay attention, she has no symbol on her head, she has a white wig. Isida is the ruler of Thessaly. Isida is the ruler of Nubia. Due to the fact that in Nubia, throughout its duration, we remember, the cult of the mother goddess was always very developed. Isida, as the embodiment of the motherhood of the Egyptian culture, became very quickly the most popular Nubian goddess. And in later times, Isida was worshipped here for many centuries, and the temples here were built by the goddess the most diverse. But of course, the largest and most amazing temple of Nubia is the temple which in ancient times was called Meha. Of course, now we all know the complex of Ramesses the Great in Abu Simbel, 4 giant colossi, 21 metres high. One of them fell during the earthquake during the reign of Ramses II. The fallen part of the statue could not be raised. The temple did not become popular. It was quickly covered with sand. For Ramses, it became a symbol of 2 collapses. On the one hand, the collapse of such a fantastic facade on which a huge amount of effort. On the other hand, judging by indirect sources, his beloved wife, Queen Nefertari, died quite quickly after visiting the open Abu Simbel. Therefore, he is associated with bad experiences of Ramses, but he became, of course, one of the legends of ancient Egypt. And this is a shot made when the sun is just rising. Therefore, it is still blue, almost night sky, and suddenly at some point from grey-black, the temple becomes saffron. This is an incredible impression, and I highly recommend you, if you go to see Abu Simbel, do not do it as everyone does. People go to Abu Simbel early in the morning by bus, not sleeping, exhausted. Make yourself a holiday. Give yourself pleasure. Go to Abu Simbel the day before. There are 2 hotels there. Stay in Abu Simbel. And until there's not a single car, early in the morning, come to the temple of Ramses and see how Ramses will smile looking at the rising sun. Only then will all the tourists come. Who will prevent you from watching the temple of Ramses in Abu Simbel? This is my military advice to you. Very useful. Let's go inside the temple for a second. Huge Assyrian colossi of the king, the richest palette of reliefs that tell about the military victories of Ramses and his achievements. And of course the sanctuary, where Ramses, or rather from right to left, the god of the sun, Ramses in the crown of Cyprus, Amun in the high crown of Shuti, and the god Ptah, who always stays in the dark as a patron of the secret forces of the earth. Twice a year, as you know, the sun passes exactly along the axis and highlights the figures of Amun, Ramses and Ptah in the darkness. In Egypt, it is necessarily told that this is the birthday, the day of the coronation of Ramses II. This is a tourist fairy tale. We do not know the date of the coronation and the birthday of Ramses II. Just such a beautiful legend. But the temple later, when it was moved to a new place, it retained this unique feature chosen by the Egyptian architects, and the Mecca rock itself, in which it was created, and the neighbouring Ibshak rock, where the small temple of Queen Nefertari is, both rocks were sacred. Moreover, Ibshak was revered by the local Nubian tribes, and accordingly, if there was an apotheosis of Ramses the Sun, victory, triumph and war, then in the small temple of Queen Nefertari, well, first of all, it is deified as the star Sirius. There is a temple in which there are a lot of images of the mother goddess and Kador, a temple in which the reliefs are made of lower quality because there is a denser sandstone. Let's look at the facade. Let's not be mistaken in size. The height of the columns is more than 6 meters. They are grandiose. And here on this facade is the famous epithet of Queen Nefertari. Ramses calls her Taradi, which shines in the sun, an epithet that no other Egyptian queen inside a rather modest architecture. Cathartic pilasters with masks of the goddess Kador, but amazingly beautiful reliefs. And here, on one of these reliefs, Ramses triumphantly beats Nubians, representatives of this land, and behind him, blessed with his attention, hereditary nobility, sweet love, the most beautiful of women, Queen Nefertari. Did Ramses the Great think, living in the 13th century, that after several centuries everything will change, as it was said in Egypt, as in a potter's wheel, and instead of the Egyptian nobility in Nubia, a completely different story will come? At the turn of the 11th century, centuries before the new era, Egypt begins to slowly lean into a crisis at the end of the New Kingdom. And as soon as Egypt leans into a crisis, Nubia begins to flourish, because Egypt ceases to pull everything possible and impossible from there. And it was at this time in the 8th century BC in the south, near Kerma, a new dynasty appears in Napa. It will be the dynasty that will capture Egypt for 72 years, and will be the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. Taharka, one of the most famous kings of this dynasty, his sculptural portrait, part of the Colossus, will be presented at the Nubian Museum in Aswan. How to prove to the world that you are the king of this land. From the point of view of the Egyptian world, and in the broad sense of the word, it is necessary to honour God. And therefore, when the dynasties of the Kushite rulers capture Egypt, they come here to Karnak. By the way, this is the sunset in Karnak, which is completely unique. And in the first courtyard of the Karnak temple, in front of the pylons, which were once built in the 13th century by Ramses II, as such a visual continuity, in order to show that we are the heirs of this world, Tsar Taharka is building his grandiose colonnade. Alas, there is only one column left now. Initially there were 10 of them. In the centre there is a pedestal for the sacred alabaster boat. This is the boat of the Amun god, which was taken out of the temple during the major holidays. The most different statues. Here is the statue of Ramses II, the Sphinx of Tutankhamun on the right. There is such a history of the Egyptian civilization tied to the axis of the Karnak temple, to the axis of the veneration of Amun Favansky as a visible form of God the Eternal. We lost these things quite recently. David Roberts, the first ruler of Karnak, 1837. After one of the earthquakes, the columns of Taharka fell and collapsed on the drums, and the local residents immediately dragged these drums to the mills, to the construction of their houses. And here further in the first courtyard of Karnak, there was a square for military exercises in the name of the local mayor. Only one column remained, and then, by the incredible titanic work of the outstanding French archaeologist and architect Henri Chevrier, it was managed to strengthen. At an altitude of almost 22 metres, what 100 people fit on this capital? Once the column was painted. Here are the reliefs, once former polychromes. Here is Taharka. How the Egyptian king rejoices at the peace of the Egyptian gods. If we look at the visual reconstruction, it is clear that polychromy is missing here. Here is such a kiosk, we call it so conventionally. There was never a roof. There were wooden beams of the roof. And at the moment when the parade boat of the god Amun came out of the temple during the holiday, it was covered with a red sewn up tent on top. That is, the roof was made of fabric. There was such a sacred cover thrown on these grandiose columns. The spectacle, of course, was very serious. Further, when we look at the behaviour of the Kushite kings in Egypt, we see that most of all they want to be Egyptians. They really want to be legal Egyptian kings. Well, let's start with the fact that one of the first Kushite kings, in fact the one who conquered Egypt, was called Pianhe, or Pa, the second version of his name. He has his huge ceremonial stele, the stele of Pianhe's victory. By the way, it is translated into Russian. It is huge. If you are interested, find it on the internet, read it. You'll find a lot of interesting things there. And then Pianhe goes practically without resistance, conquers Ephesus and Memphis, because the local dynasties are practically politically and militarily incapacitated at that time. And, you know, he's amazed. The Byzantines always loved horses. They love horses very much. And Pianhe writes that, well, okay, that the temples were abandoned in Memphis, and these are his temples. He is a man of another nationality, but of this culture. And it is absolutely amazing. Okay, that there was a bazaar in the first courtyard of the Temple of the Bird of Memphis. There were stalls there, they traded there. Okay, but what a terrible condition the horses are in. What a disgrace. What kind of people are you, the Egyptians? Piana describes the condition of these royal horses. Well, since you have such horses, you are definitely not a king. And then they begin to restore the temples. And one of the successors of Pianhe, Shabak, finds in the Temple of the Bird in Memphis a scroll of eaten worms. He literally calls it that. And this, oh my God, this is a text telling how the bird creates peace in Memphis. That is, this is the main theological treatise of this temple, and he orders to capture this text on a stone. And this stone has come to our time. Fortunately, it is kept in the British Museum. Pianhe, Shabak, Shabatak, Taharka. Taharka builds this, and look at the beautiful object in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is a counterweight to the ritual necklace of the men. And here's a little King Taharka. He's here, a child, so bare, small, but in the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And the goddess Bastet, in her triumphal form, this is not Ishmed, this is Bastet. The name is signed. She feeds him with her breast. They create a world where the Egyptians look a little ashamed because they, the people of this religion, of this world, kept the temples in the abyss, did not really deal with the cults of sending gods. Already built little, and suddenly people with black skin begin to build this new amazing world. Moreover, here in Karnakia, the Kushite kings forced the high priest, the wife of the god Amon in Karnakia, to adapt, that is, to accept in the adopted daughter the Kushite beauty. This is how Amunerdis appears, the famous wife of the god, the statue of which before you. She became one of the masterpieces of Karnakia. She is like a queen. She has a scepter of the Queen Hétis. She has a boar in the form of a mane on a red wig. She has, which is very interesting, here's an image of a man and two snakes, because one snake is Egypt and the second snake is Nubia. Here is a story about the Egyptian and the Nubian snake. Remember, on top of the crown, the Hammodius, in the form of the sacred cobras of the mother goddess. In the right hand of Nadejda, the necklace of the men, the statue of Approaching on the pedestal from another darker material, on which it is written the dedication of Imanerdis. And Imanerdis is like Amundao Yo. When in 1858 in Karnakia, in the northern part of Karnakia, Auguste Mariette was found, he was so shocked that on the basis of the image of this woman, and on the basis of the epoch of the confrontation of Egypt and Nubia, he will write a plot for the future parody of Aida, where the Tsar's daughter Meneres is actually Imanerdis, the great Karnakian priestess. By the way, another wonderful monument associated with the wife of God. She is a priestess, beloved by her God, and therefore everyone always shows a parade monument. I will show you a very rare statuette from the Cairo Museum. This is Amen God, who holds his priestess on his lap because she is beloved to him. Here is such a touching, emotional statuette, which was also one of the important elements of the iconography of the great Karnakian priestess. Another one of the Nubian priests on the throne of Karnakia, Shepenepel II. Once upon a time, on the shore of a sacred lake in the Karnakian temple, stood this granite sphinx of hers. She is here in a luxurious wig of the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love, and she holds in her hands a vessel with a lid with the head of the sacred oven. Oven is, as you remember, the sacred animal of Amun God, a vessel for the water of the Nova Plavodia. That is, when they rise, they collect water. And this priestess is depicted as a keeper. Therefore she is a sphinx, which brings to Amun the first vessel filled with water of the Nova Plavodia. This water is magical. It is connected with purification, with various temple ceremonies. And then, as a result, several such black-skinned women keep the temple of Amun in Karnakia. Here on the left is Shepenupet, depicted as a queen. Look at the crown on the Sphinx, and she is on the wall of her own tomb, and the tomb was in the Jewish collective Medina Taboo. She is worshipped by Racharakte, the goddess of Isis. Isis is the great mother of God, and the hereditary nobility of the great praise of the wife of God, namely Erdis, her predecessor. That is the same priestess who became her mother-in-law and raised in turn a new Karnakian priestess. We understand that the wives of God in the first millennium BC were all royal daughters, but they were virgin priests. They did not marry, and therefore every time the eldest priestess adopted as a daughter the next priestess who took her throne. Not only in Egypt, of course, Taharqa is built. Taharqa is built in her homeland and in a place which was called, as you remember, Gempoaton. That is Kava. In Kava, he builds a temple. Look at the plan of the temple of Amun in Kava. That is an absolutely Egyptian temple. The temple was luxurious. The red rectangle is the small sanctuary of Taharqa, which was made with special art, and probably that is why it is now in the collection of the Ishmael Museum in Oxford. On the walls of this small sanctuary, Taharqa worships the Savanian gods, the Memphisian gods, and the Nubian gods. Three sacred centres, Siva, Memphis, and South Nubia, which we will talk about now. In this kiosk, in this sanctuary, it is said that the craftsmen who made it were specially brought from Memphis. The Memphisian craftsmen, when they sent the deep Nubia to Kava, well, what can you do? It's the king's order. And this monument, which apparently was once very brightly painted, is now so reconstructed in the Ishmael Museum that there is this statue inside. Very beautiful. This is the statue of Taharqa. But Taharqa is depicted here in the image of Osiris Onagishi, one of the most important gods of the Delta, thereby showing that his power also spread to the Delta. Well, of course, it didn't work out like in Amenhotep III, although it was very much wanted, but there were no such craftsmen. Therefore, in Kava, in front of the temple of the god Amun, there is such an alley of magnificent ovens. Under the chin of each oven of Amun, there is Taharqa, like his earthly son. One oven is now in the British Museum. The second is in the Ishmael Museum in Oxford. This greatness, which was borrowed by the Black Kings from their Egyptian predecessors, is, of course, very serious here. And these monuments, the monuments of the first magnitude, of course, make you think. This is the museum hall in Kerma. These are the statues of the kings of the 25th and later dynasties. Here is Taharqa. Here is Senka Maniskin. Here is Aspelta. Other rulers. If you look closely at these statues, you will see that at the level of the hip girders, where the decoration is, where the crowns are, the stone is not fully polished. This is how these statues originally looked. Very recently in 1922, if my memory does not change, in Louvre, there was an amazing exhibition of the king of the two lands, dedicated to the Black Pharaohs, and then the statues were scanned from the Kerma Museum and from the museum in Khartoum. They were examined on the subject of microdoses of pigments and materials, and then such reconstructions which show how they originally looked. This is the central column of Taharqa. Pay attention. A very specific Nubian golden crown, a hat with two urethra, the urethra of Egypt and the urethra of Nubia, a necklace with the heads of the Ons, because this is the sacred Omon of Nubia, to which we will now come. And then the rest of the iconography of the Egyptian kings. These monuments were amazing. Remember this frame. It will come in handy very soon. And if in Karnak it was necessary for the Egyptians to prove that you are a legitimate ruler, then the main construction was, of course, in the homeland. Before you is the main ritual spiritual centre of ancient Nubia. This is the Gebel Barkal rock. The rock is known since the middle of the New Kingdom, and the first temples at the foot of the Pure Mountain, as it was called, were built during the reign of Thutmose III in the 15th century BC. This is a huge, massive platform with a height of about 100 metres, which is considered the foothill of the House of God, and there, on the right side from the rock, 75 metres high, it resembles a cobra in the crown of Upper Egypt, and it was there that this mountain was considered especially a holy place. The main god of the Gebel Barkal is Amun of the Pure Mountain, and if in Karnak Amun has mainly anthropomorphic appearance, then here it is a man with the head of the holy oven, because the nameless, some kind of native god of the tribe of Nubia, revered on this earth from the 4th millennium BC. It was the oven, which was still decorated. It had a headdress in the form of a large straw cylinder. And this oven became the original Nubian god, adapted to the Egyptian name, to the Egyptian cult. The rock itself is now badly damaged, and the rarest relief, few people will show it to you, but it is the rock of Abu Simbel. Ramses II worships the god Amun. The god Amun is here inside the mountain. It's the Pure Mountain. It is the Gebel Barkal. And here comes out of the Gebel Barkal the sacred snake in the crown of Upper Egypt. Amazingly, I was told all the time by an amazing person who gave all his life to the Gebel Barkal, an American professor, Dr. Timothy Kendall, and Kendall climbed with the climbers to this rock. Apparently a lot of work was done in the era of Tsar Taharqa. This mountain was a little additionally cut off in the form of a cobra, and the crown of Upper Egypt was also well done. And then, where the cobra had a central ribbon on its neck, there were golden leaves with the names of Taharqa and his parents. That is, above all this huge space, as we will see now, there was a giant cobra in the crown of Upper Egypt, and then it had a golden neck. The temple of the Gebel Barkal, just like the temple of Kerma, remember the platforms on which the gods live, the symbols are the same. They rise to a very ancient idea. This is purely Nubian, this is not Egypt, that God lives in the mountain. In the Gebel Barkal, in the Holy of Holies of the central temple, this object was found. This is a model of what later ancient cultures will call Amphilos. This is the dome of the earth. This is the centre of the world, which is a sacred mountain that Amon lives inside. The figure has not been preserved. It is revered by the king on both sides, and it is protected by the goddess. You understand that this is the same object. This is a front, and then this is a side view of this monument. Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This was a native Nubian shrine, and the memory of the original temple is the same as it was before the appearance of the Egyptian giganomania. So this is the entrance to the central part of the temple, where Taharqa transferred the owns of Menhotep III from Solib, because he could not do it himself. And then the Solib temple became a quarry from where all the most beautiful monuments were transferred here to this amazing place. Look at the view from above. There are temples down there, and there were a lot of temples. I will show you now a reconstruction of what has been preserved. And there is the whole central part of the great kingdom of Napata, which was not only a competitor to the pharaohs of Egypt in these years, but also the land where Egypt was conquered. A view of the central temple of the god Amun from above, and next to it is a fragment of the so-called wall of the 700th temple. This is the temple where the royal coronations of the kings of Napata, that is the Kushites, took place. The Nubian king Senkamoniskan is absolutely in the Egyptian canonical position of all enemies. It is difficult to say which state, because the king is Nubian, and it is written the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the ruler of both lands, the son of the sun, the ruler of the sun. The Egyptian titles, what two lands, here the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, changed to other two lands, to the Nubian land and to the Egyptian land. This is how it used to look like. This is a good architectural reconstruction. In the centre, there is the so-called Temple of the 500th. This is the central temple of the god Amun. Then the Temple of the 700th, where there were royal coronations and many, many other sanctuaries, richly decorated with both earlier Egyptian monuments and what the Kushite kings created. This is a reconstruction of Jean-Claude Guillaume. Very pretty, and it gives you an idea of the greatest spiritual and cultural centre of the ancient Sudan, of the ancient Nubia. The only thing is that here the rock stands like an atrock. It still had a snake shape. Due to the fact that in Nubia, more than in Egypt, there were strong male phallic cults, it is also described in the text that this rock is not only a snake, it is a phallus of the god Amun, which is always strong, always striving to create a new world. That is, the phallic symbolism in the death of Barkal has always been very strong. Fortunately, among the ruins of the temples here in the death of Barkal and Nightframe, the temple of the goddess Mut has been preserved. It is clear that Mut acts here as the wife of the god Amun. This temple is partially rocky, magnificent American reconstruction. Here you can see the statue of the priest. The Kushites carry children in the temple. Pay attention to the colossal figures of Bes. Here in the central courtyard, which was still open to the sun, a modern proportional reconstruction. Here the main colossal figures, of course, were painted the figures of Bes. Just as Bes in the temples of the goddesses of Egypt kept the womb of the mother, he also keeps this womb here. And inside there are such reliefs, golden figures against the background of a fantastic blue sky. This is the sky of another world. And here is Tahark himself. His entire title is written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. He is Nefertum-Hura Tahark, and he brings vessels and gifts to Amun, Mut, and other Favan deities, as Said did. And just as in the deified during the life of Ramses the Great, around the ear is a short lamb horn, here is the same. This short lamb horn is present as a sign that the earthly god speaks to his heavenly ancestors. And among the very interesting reliefs inside the Temple of Mut, a very damaged image, but again Tahark worships the mountain itself. And if during Ramses II it was shown with a horn in the form of a snake, a cobra-wrapped headgear, the crown of Upper Egypt, here is a sun disk, but still this symbolism of a great snake, the source of the royal power, the source of the family power of the Napata kings. It is of course present here. And here is such an incredible colossus. This is Tahark from the temple in Gebel Barkal, the National Archaeological Museum of Sudan in Khartoum. The damage of the crown, it is clear that it was the crown of Amun-Shuti, and at the same time the crown itself, which is on the head of the king, this is the Nubian crown. That is, there is a combination of Egyptian and Nubian features. But the monument, of course, is absolutely fantastic. This is one of the famous Nubian objects from the Louvre collection, the knee-bowed Tahark before the god Hemen. Hemen is the Nubian form of the falcon. That is, here the king honours the falcon as the chief of power. Here is silver, bronze and gold. Yes, it may not be as artful as in the time of Ramses the Great, but the monument, of course, is still wonderful. In Napa, in the south, there were 3 great royal necropolises, and the first small necropolis was in Gebel Barkal. That is, here's the rock, and behind it there are such absolutely amazing pyramids. I specially prepared some hints related to necropolises for myself today, because for you friends, for people who love Egypt very much, it will be very interesting to listen to the names of Nubian kings and queens. This is what is absolutely beyond the classical interest of an Egyptologist, but in fact it is wrong, because of course you can't tear Egypt from Nubia. So the main burials of the necropolis of Gebel Barkal are mostly the burials from the 3rd to the 1st century BC, that is later. Tsar Tarikos, Tsarina Amanarina, Tsarina Navidamak, Tsar Sabrakamani, Tsar Aktisanes, Tsar Aryamani. In general, the ear that got used to the Egyptian names, it should sound somehow more than unusual. In fact, when you study the Kushite royal families, it is very clear who is more a supporter of Nubian views and who loved Egypt, because suddenly an Egyptian name appears. And this is also very interesting. It shows their internal policy. Here is such a bracelet from the 1st century BC with the image of Moses. Unfortunately, it is not known whose tomb it is. It is Gebel Barkal, and from somewhere from Gebel Barkal there is a very famous monument which is kept in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. This is the head of the golden oven. It is actually not big, but it is Gebel Barkal. Apparently it was received by the black diggers, and then for a long time Gebel Barkal was in Israel in the collection of the famous collector Norbert Schimmel. And then, shortly before his death, Norbert Schimmel gave several things from his collection as a gift to various museums, and Gebel Barkal's head was received by the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Alas, there is no context from the tomb or from the temple. We will probably never know. Let's look at the map. Here we have Gebel Barkal. By the way, I must say that the name of this place can be pronounced in different ways, because Gebel Barkal is the Egyptian dialect of the Arabic language. Jabal Barkal is Sudanese, so it can be both. So here it is written Jabal Barkal. Near the pyramid of Gebel Barkal there is an orange dot, and the green and red dots are those amazing necropolises where we are going. First, El Kuru in the south, and then the necropolis of Nuri, which also played a very important role at that time. Not only in Meroe was there a Firlin, similar people in Firlin were here in El Kuru. Only one pyramid still stands. Nameless, there are no inscriptions. What do we have here? Well, first of all, the more ancient burials were made according to the Nubian ritual. These were fences with round hills inside, and there were burials under the hill. Then pyramids were built according to the Egyptian canon, and from most of the pyramids of Al Kuru, only the dungeons remained. This is the only example, I repeat, the nameless pyramid. But it gives an impression about this architecture, and then you go down there, and in several cases you will have an amazing impression. We are now looking at the painting from the burial chamber of the king of Thanutamani, the successor of Kataharkia. And here in the centre is Thanutamani. He is led by the Egyptian gods. He is Osiris, the king, and so on. That is, everything here is Egyptian except for the Nubian Kushite diadem, except for the fact that this is a combination of the Egyptian canon, the Egyptian language, the Egyptian gods, and the Kushite kings. Fortunately, the upper part of the painting of the underground chambers has been preserved. I do not show what is below. The fact is that these rooms are carved right in the rock sandy ground, and accordingly, near the Nile, as soon as the Nile rose, water came here, and below the belt there is nothing. Everything is washed away by water. But here is Isis on the left, Nephthys on the right, and then the space of his burial chamber opens. Where are the prayers? Where is the Book of the Dead? And where's the dream to see the rise of the sun? And there, in the upper part, in the temple of this wall, there is a sunbed, 4 baboons, the traditional Ba'ut Yaptet, and the jackals of another world. And pay attention how much of the Egyptian text is not royal, but human. Because the main plot, he spells the soul, not to testify against the heart. This is Ba, as you know, and here is the heart, depicted, by the way, not quite in Egyptian, but in Nubian. And here is the spell and the dream of justification in the burial chamber of the king. That is what in the Egyptian canon, in principle, could not happen. Accordingly, another dungeon, which here in El Kuru perfectly preserve the painting. This is the Queen of Kalhata. This is the mother of Thanutamani. And here appears Osiris twice, very Egyptian, directly copied from the Egyptian originals. And on the one hand, here's the burial of the Queen of Kalhata, and it is shown as the burial of a noble lady. But on one of the paintings, the rarest example, she appears in a parade headdress. That is, she has practically naked skulls without a wig, and she is wearing a neret, a golden necklace, which is taken again from the Egyptian iconographic canon. On the left is a large fragment, the rarest frames, so that you can see it. And on the right, with such a wonderful face, is the head of Ushepti, because all the Kushite kings and queens have Ushepti absolutely in the Egyptian way. And now I will show you a part of one of the tombs of El Kuru, which belonged to the nameless queen. She has preserved amazing things. Here is a set of things on the left, all in Boston, in the Museum of Fine Arts. On the right, Amon Gibel Barkalski in the form of a sphinx, with the head of Ovna on a pedestal made of sacred stone. An absolute masterpiece on the left. And this is a reliquary where the lid is removed. There's an empty golden cylinder in which there was some scattered substance, either ash from something, which we do not know, unfortunately, because all these things were found in the first decade of the 20th century by the Americans. The ashes were simply thrown away during the restoration, and it is not clear what was there, but there was some kind of reliquary. This is a ball made of mountain crystal, decorated with a head, either Kadhor or ash. It can be both. A fantastic monument and a golden base. Here is such a reliquary, a very beautiful, maybe not ideal enough by Egyptian standards, lining either on a mummy or on a piece of furniture. This is silver, an incredible treasure. This is from the Pyramid of 52, which belonged to the Queen Neferu Kakashta. This is the wife of Pian, the one who conquered Egypt. This is approximately 716, 701 BC. Either ash or Kador, although I'm more inclined to ash, feeds the queen's breast when entering another world. On the right, the thing is clear, a golden necklace, African, very Egyptian, despite the queen with a sun disk on her head. These golden necklaces, typical for tropical Africa. On the left, despite the embalming, despite the Egyptian amulets in the Nubian burials under the pyramids, there were elements of their faith. They were buried not in the sarcophagus, but on the bed. It was a kind of burial ritual bed. In the pyramid of one of the queens, the legs of the bed looked like sacred ducks. These are papyrus ducks, and then a burial bed was attached. One such duck is kept in Boston. It is in front of you. And the second such duck is bronze in Khartoum in the National Archaeological Museum. The next necropolis, El Kuru, was in Nuri to the north. This is the main pyramid of Nuri. This is the pyramid of Taharqa. He buried all his loved ones there. This is a kind of native necropolis. And now, attention, if you stand on the platform of the mountain of Gebel Barkal, so that the snake is right in front of you, at the sunset, the sun will rise right along the axis of the pyramid of Taharqa. This is the Egyptian paradigm of solar connections embodied in architecture. Egyptian masters, of course, the locals would not have done it, were embodied here. And not only this, first, this is a view of the necropolis of Nuri from the pyramid of Taharqa. These are funny pyramids by Egyptian standards. And speaking of the height of the necropolis, the height of the pyramid of Taharqa is 52 meters. To compare it, it is almost like the pyramid of Djoser, a little smaller, or like the pyramid of Menkaure in Giza. By Egyptian standards, it is not much. But under this pyramid, there is a completely amazing thing. Under the pyramid of Taharqa was made a copy of the Abydosian Osirion. There is a descent which eventually leads you to the platform. This is an island surrounded by water, gigantic megalithic pillars, and like Osiris in Abydos, Taharka on the island under its own pyramids lying surrounded by water. This is an absolutely incredible thing, which says that the Nubian kings studied the Egyptian culture very seriously. He was an Osirian in Abydos. He saw it, he was shocked, and for his tomb he chose such an amazing model. Not much has been preserved. Those amulets that are in front of you are from the underground of the pyramid. Nevertheless, the pyramid contained the royal tomb. There were golden things there. On the right is the eye of Hora Ujad, the symbol of immortality. Below is an amulet of a golden falcon. This is an amazing object. This is a ring from the finger of the half-dead mummy of the king of Taharka, and the ring is very Nubian. This is an eye from the eye of Porche, and it is designed in the form of such a very natural eye, not in the form, for example, of the eye of Hora Ujad. The Kushites kings love the golden rings, like this one. The golden rings, the golden amulets. What has come to our time, agree, shows that the tombs were rich, the remains of the king of Taharka. There are several hundred of them. This is a collection of remains from different materials. These remains are in Boston. There are remains of the king of Taharka. They, of course, are not very canonical from the Egyptian point of view, but the texts of the Book of the Dead are all written in the beautiful Egyptian hieroglyphic language. So everything is possible. This is also a very good group of comrades. These are the remains of the king of Taharka. And here, somewhere there are royal egregales, somewhere not. I just admire their faces. Here, this canon of the Egyptian with the eternal smile that will no longer be here, as it turned out, but sometimes it turns out absolutely amazing monuments. Therefore, such a group also from the Boston Museum. Under some pyramids in Nuri, there are paintings, the rarest frames, from which I was given for a lecture by my colleagues from Canada who are digging under this pyramid. This is the pyramid of the Queen Eturoi, the wife of the king of Atlaners. For most, probably, the names do not say anything at all, as I understand it, quite unexpectedly. Nevertheless, the Egyptian canon, here it is, Eturoi herself stands there as the great wife of God. Before her, Osiris and Isis. And I also want to read you a few names. So this is the necropolis of Nuri. By the way, next to it, most of the pyramids of Nuri were dismantled at the neighbouring monastery. They just became quarry. They were still there somewhere from the 16th, 17th century. The pyramids were all intact. So Nuri, the king of Taharka, the king of Senkamuniskin, his son Anlamani, the king of Karkamani, the king of Aspelta, the son of Senkamuniskin, and the queen of Pariah, the king of Amani Natakelepte. We will now see a fantastic monument from the tomb, the king of Amani Tayarike, the king of Nastasin, the king of Talahamani, the king of Baskaki Kiran, the king of Analmai, the king of Nasahma, the king of Atlaners, the son of Taharka, and many others. The queen of Tahatanum, the queen of Masalach, the queen of Hinutabit, the queen of Abar, the wife of Pienhi, the mother of Taharka, the queen of Atihbaskin, the eldest wife of Taharka, the queen of Malataral, the wife of Atlaners, the queen of Malakaya, the wife of Tsaratunutamani, and the queen of Ajaturui, against the background of the tomb where we stand. There are a lot of tombs, not even a dozen. There are no names, no sign things. This is how the American specialists, together with the Sudanese, George Reisner came there, if I remember correctly, in 1911. The expedition actively completed its work up to the 1930s. They, of course, also brought a huge number of things from there, and suddenly there appeared almost royal things. This is the sarcophagus of Tsar Spelti, Boston Museum of Contemporary Art. It is made of reddish granite. An interesting difference from the Egyptian sarcophagi is the stone chacal on top, Anubis on the left, and in the front, right in the centre, the stone falcon Ahom, the sacred bird of Saqqara. Look at Egypt. These are drawings of its walls. On one wall, Nephthida, Osiris, Anubis, various other Egyptian deities. On the other, on the left, Isida, before Osiris, Anubis, the keeper of the gates of another world, a spell from the late Egyptian texts. That is, quite surprisingly, on the one hand, Egyptian images are attached, but absolutely Egyptian Isida on his knees, on the sign of gold, spinning sign of infinity. And on the other hand, the composition is not Egyptian. The composition is already different. The composition is clearly made with the participation of local masters. And this side wall of the sarcophagus is very Egyptian. The sons of Ahura, the keepers of the canopies and the northern part of the sky, and the god who opens the heavenly doors for the entity of the king, Aspelti. These are the eyes of his unsaved cover of the wooden sarcophagus. Unfortunately, it was moulded. Water got there. Apparently, the cover was very rich, such an incrustation. It is, of course, simple by Egyptian standards, but my friends still tried to follow the Egyptian sample here. And such beautiful, by the way, very high quality inscriptions of King Aspelti in front of you, completely covered with Egyptian texts. His names are written here. Everything is as it should be. Boston Museum of Fine Arts. There, next to the pyramid, of course, was the late temple, the sacrifice of King Aspelti, absolutely Egyptian, with offerings for the entity of the king. And here is such a stela. On the left is a stela, on the right is a large upper fragment where the king himself stands in front of Osiris, Isis, and Anubis. Pay attention, not a choir, but Anubis. Here the cult of Anubis was closer to Isis, the keeper of the dead forms. It was more important than the cult of the Abydian triad, a very beautiful monument. This is the mask of Queen Malakia. Also Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This is the wife of Thanatomania. This is Electrum. This is not gold. This is the most amazing metal mask from the Nubian royal tombs which have come to our time. It is small. At the same time, it is a pity that in Boston, if you have been there, most of the halls of the Fine Arts Museum are not exhibited. There is no place. Oh, they took it out of Sudan. There is no place to exhibit it. And the mask of Queen Malakia is not in use. And my American colleagues, Egyptologists, write about it, that it is impossible, but not only in the Hermitage, as they say, unfortunately. Therefore, in Boston, the same sad situation. Scarab of Queen Malatharal, the wife of Atlaniers, an absolutely Egyptian scarab of the heart. That is what we can follow Egypt in the royal tombs of Nubia. And this is, of course, a fantastic monument. This is the patch of the pectoral in the form of the goddess Isis. On the chest of the king Amani Natakleptem, I promised you an amazing thing. This is Isis, the throne on her head. In one hand she has the Ankh, and everyone understood that. In the other hand, it is more difficult to recognize the symbol. This is an inflated sail. This is Chow. That is literally, it is read as Isis carrying Chow and Ankh, the breath of eternal life. That breath of eternal life is the main concept of the life of ancient Egypt, which these kings borrowed from the world of their Egyptian colleagues. A very beautiful monument. I think you understand that we are talking about the same thing. This is the silver mirror of King Amani Natakele Patim. And here he goes himself together with Amon. Here is Amon in the full version of the frame. Here is Amon, here is Chor, here is Ra, here is himself in the big crown in the middle frame. Here is Amani Natakele Patim himself. And accordingly, This is the mirror in which the king looked in the morning, who miraculously ended up in the tomb. But from one of the old tombs in Amazing Ba, this is an image of the soul. And here, Nubian Ba is very different, because the Nubian Ba always has a large body. It is often depicted in the form of a human figure with wings, or in the form of a bird with human arms or legs. This anthropomorphization, in the history with Nubian images of the soul, it is stronger than in Egypt, but agree, the monument is absolutely wonderful. Boston, Museum of Natural Arts, the crown with a mummy of one of the Kushite kings, not a king, but a king, gold. And this is a very beautiful set from the tomb of the son of Tahark, the king of Atlanors. On the one hand, it is very Egyptian. Look what a fantastic travertine, the same Egyptian alabaster. And on the other hand, the alabaster is a vessel for incense, and where it is absolutely Nubian. Now you can buy such a thing which is made in exactly the same style, because the tradition continues. Well, and characteristic for Nubian royal funerals, gold cases for papyruses, for magic texts. Here, in fact, the papyrus on the left, on the left frame in the centre, it is the same. Here is a large figure of the goddess Mut, the wife of the god Amun, unfortunately, of course. In the humid climate of these pyramids, no papyruses, no organics are preserved at all. Therefore, unfortunately, such a wealth of evidence about the life of the past, which is there, here, it is impossible to boast. The canopy of the king of Atlanors is absolutely without any royal regalia. That is here, of course. The funerals are much more modest than the corresponding Egyptian funerals. Two wonderful statues, Tahurchemet, and they have a hole in the left mouth. There was a metal snake. This is the statue of Abiregi, and in fact a phoenix amulet with the image of the names of the king, which are already written with Egyptian hieroglyphs, as it was done in Egypt many millennia before. Well, a few more amulets from the royal tombs of Nuri. Look what a fantastic statue on the left, with such spread wings. Absolutely Nubian. Egyptian art does not know this. These shots were taken not so long ago in the United States at the exhibition dedicated to the kings of Nubia. So here, of course, you can see the rarest monuments in the Russian language space. You will never find this. The king sits in the central pectoralis, and flowers of water, lily, horn, and accordingly his mother, Isis. Well, a few more amulets, a fantastic semet with urea frontal, not Egyptian at all, and of course Bes and Basid were very revered both, as you have already understood, in Gilbarkal and in the royal tombs. Bes, the universal deity that united Egypt and Nubia, was loved in houses in the north and in the south. The history of the royal house of the Black Dynasty ends very harshly. It is interrupted by the Assyrian invasion, because the Assyrian king Assar Kadun comes to Egypt. The parade stela of Assar Kadun, which is now kept in Berlin in the museum, Assar Kadun took by the attack of Thebes. And the Assyrians, who were very cruel people, the Assyrians who decorated the walls of the feast halls with skins taken from people, from their enemies. They burned Thebes. They spared only the temples. That is why we do not have Theban secular architecture. It was all burned by Assar Kadun, and then Taharka in horror runs to Napata, to his native capital, and in Memphis Assar Kadun captures Ushin-Kura, his son, who will go to terrible Nineveh. And here these two people, it is clear that you have already realized that this is the son of Taharka. On his knees he has a Nubian face, an Egyptian snake, and the second figure, a little higher, is the king of the rebellious Sidon, the Phoenician king, who was also captured and killed in Nineveh by Assyrian troops. Assyrian rule in Egypt was not long, but it was terrible for Egypt itself, and it forever put a cross on the Nubian dynasty. The rarest reliefs of the British Museum collection are taken by Assyrians from one of the Egyptian cities. If you look closely, this fortress is buried here, and archers there, and those who are taken out of this city, they do not have an Egyptian appearance, they have a Nubian appearance, because the noble Egyptian families very quickly agreed with the Assyrians, and in the end they let the Assyrian army to the south on purpose, so that Asar Kadum took down the Black Eagle and killed the Black Kings. It was done absolutely on purpose, and there is evidence of this which I will show you very soon. As a result, only 72 years have passed, 725, 653 BC, the era of the reign of the Tsars Napata in Egypt, and literally a few years later, the Egyptian Tsar Psamtik II, with the Egyptian Assyrian army united, he will storm Napata and the temple of Amun-Gibel Bar Kalski. And then in the fortress, these statues will be deprived of gold, deprived of all jewellery, their heads will be cut off, and they will be thrown into the pit. This is how the Colossus of the Kushite Tsars in 2003 was found in the fortress by the great French archaeologist Charles Bonnet. For a recent exhibition in the Louvre, they were scanned, 3D copies were made, and based on the study of the decoration, this reconstruction was made. This frame was made in the Louvre. Look at the amazing statues of the Tsars standing in the fortress in the temple of Amun-Gibel Bar Kalski. How unusual and amazing it was. Well, in general, Psamtik II, when he destroyed these statues, he thereby preserved them for eternity. Because the heads are restored, gold is not the greatest loss. And then, when the Nubian kingdom collapsed, the heir of Taharq and Thanutamani, two amazing events took place. The first event is that the Egyptian troops reached the 5th threshold of the Nile to Karkur. The Egyptian legs never stepped there. Nubia were subordinated to all the ships. On the other hand, on the parade stele of Thanutamani, when he still does not know what is ahead of him, he says that he has a dream. And Thanutamani dreams that there are 2 snakes, and 2 snakes crawl away from him, from his hands. And then, in the morning, he calls the court wise men, the priests, and asks, what does it mean? What will the court wise men tell the king? That it is for glory, that it is for good luck, that danger has left the king. Do you remember the 2 snakes on the side of the Scythian king? He had a dream. It's true. Power has left him over the land of Egypt and over most of his native land after the king Psameti II came there. Actually, the king Psameti II himself, his portrait from the meeting of the Louvre and the triumphant stele that stands on the island of New Calabria, which tells how for the first time the Egyptian troops saw the 4th and the 5th threshold of the Nile, in the era when the Greek Roman influenced Nubia would be flourishing, and there would be a special cult of the Mother of God, be it Hathor or Isis. Amazing beauty, a small complex. This is the kiosk of Kartasi, or in Nubian Kardassi, the pronunciation is different. This is the kiosk that once stood on the island of Kardassi in the middle of the Nile, and at the moment when, according to legend, a great wine goddess would come from far away, from the lands of the Kushites, to find peace and become the golden Hathor. Here, in this kiosk, she was met on the border of Upper Nubia and Egypt itself. Temples are being built at this time, very beautiful. This is Dhaka. This is the temple of the god Thoth. And here, in a special way, in this temple, a legend is told about a goddess who went away, Ohorit. Do you remember the story when the sun god, deceived his daughter, protecting people, and the enraged lioness went to the distant Buhem, the country of distant Africa, and then the sun sent small pavilions in the image of which Thoth and the god of Ershu are present here. They tell the enraged lioness about the music in the homeland, the fairy tales in the homeland, what the people wear today, what are the fashionable aromas in the homeland. The heart of the lioness could not stand it, and then, returning from Egypt, she transformed into the great sacred cat Bastet, and then back to the golden goddess of love. This is a unique illustration, a relief of the gone goddess here in Nubia, in the temple of Dhaka, which is also moved to a higher place. A stunning temple in Maharakya. This is already the Greco-Roman period, and here appear again not only the Egyptian deities but also such gods. For example, this is Mandalus. Mandalus is the Nubian form of the choir. It always has a sun crown of henchmen, but like the choir of the son of Sidon, it always hides in the swamps of the delta. Accordingly, the choir, like Mandalus, is revered here, and Osiris is also revered in Nubian form under the name Aryan Snoopis. The cults are almost unchanged, but under such names it was more clear to the locals who they were talking about. Well, now we will dive into the very far south. If you remember, between Nuri and El Kuru, on the right bank of the Nile, was the Great Mirror, the very centre of the world for the Great Kandakia Monitor. This is the complex of Naga, a temple dedicated to Amun, and not only. Before the entrance, a small sanctuary, built almost in the Roman style, was dedicated to the choir of Sidon. Here, the goddess gave birth to her child. The temple in Naga is all sandstone of such a very hard yellow colour. It, of course, reproduces the Egyptian canon of Pylon, but there's a very interesting story here. On the left side, enemies are defeated in the ancient pharaoh's pose. The king, the Meroitic king Natakamani. Look carefully at the right epilogue. The great Kandakia Monitor, a woman of African beauty, of African size, also defeats enemies, because without the permission of the great Kandakia, the king cannot rule. You remember I started to tell you about it at the very beginning of the lecture. Therefore, not only the king, but also the great Kandakia is present on all the reliefs. There are a lot of images here. Here are the Egyptian gods, and among the local gods, a very special role will play this deity, which has no analogues in Egypt. This is Apedamak. He is either a man with a lion's head or a huge snake with a lion's head in the parade of the crown of the sun god. Apedamak is the god of war, the god of a victorious battle, the god of imperial power, and the god of the empire of Meroia, because now when Egypt is under the Greek-Roman rule, Meroia remains an independent kingdom. And you remember that the great Kandakia fought off the Roman troops. Inside, absolutely Egyptian architecture. But look, on the wall, the first god who is revered by the king is Apedamak. Then comes Racharakti, and then Amun-Gebel Barkalski. That is an amazing combination of cults, images, iconographies of what Egypt gave here and what the Nubian land and the hypostyle hall of the temple in Naga agree. The best Egyptian column. Magnificent. Columns of papyrus are visible, but the images here, of course, will be different, although it is clear that all the main ideas were taken from the Egyptian original. The pedestal for the sacred boat, the choir, but we remember that on the Egyptian canon, when the gods tie heraldic plants around the throat and breath, these are papyrus and lilies. This is Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Here, in both cases, this is lilies, this is Upper Egypt. Upper and Upper Egypt are connected in Meroe because, of course, the Meroitic rulers could not think, and the main complex of the kingdom of Meroe, Musavarat Sufra. This is an incredible combination of temples, dungeons, sacred lakes, streets, sanctuaries of some special shrines, was preserved quite poorly because the sandstone, which I have already explained to you, also looks like pseudo-Karnak. Here are the royal statues, but everywhere in the central part Here is a snake that should end up with a lion's head. This is in any case Apidamak. I repeat, there is no analogue to this god in Egypt. This is some kind of local cult. This could not be in Egypt either. This is the great elephant of Musavarati Sufra. The Egyptians knew, of course, that there were elephants in Egypt. There's even a burial of the favourite elephant of one of the kings of the first dynasty in Abydos. It's clear that the elephant's horse was forced into Egypt, but there were no colossal images of elephants in the pharaohs. This is pure Black Africa, where the elephant was, of course, a very important part of such an animal landscape. Well, another beautiful scene, a parade scene of Musavarati Sufra when the king comes. Here is Apid Mak in the centre, Amuna Barkalski with a human face, an atom as a symbol of the sun, as a symbol of such a legacy of the Egyptian land. Well, I can't help but show Apidamak because, of course, it's amazing how they did it. And here's another very interesting evidence. You see that the sandstone was covered with a star, and on the star it was all very richly painted. That is, all the temples of Nubia are very bright and colourful complexes, as of course it was in Egypt. Well, here it is, the necropolis of Meroe. We remembered again in Berlin, the story related to Meroe was closed. Work is still underway there. In the 1930s, there were the richest discoveries of American archaeologists. And here are the decorations of the Meroitic Kandaks. They are now partially in Boston. I'm afraid to think about those things that are in Khartoum. The upper pendants are the head of the Gebel Barkal and the Amun Meroe in the crown of Shute. And the lower pendants are the head of the goddess Mut, the wife of Amun, which is also crowned the head of Amun, the great ruler of Meroe. Well, and of course the latest Meroitic things, that is the things of the new era, are rather more gold than art, although the hint of the goddess Kador is clearly read here, but it is still gold, which became metal and lost the sacred meaning of which the speech was about. I will remind you a little about the fate of Nubia, because it is impossible not to say about it. Phileas, the great temple of the goddess Isis. We are back in Egypt, the last Egyptian temple, which was taken by the local Christian governor with a terrible stroke, and all the killed priests are still lying. And Chrysler found them on the neighbouring island of Hessa in the brothers' graves. But it was here that the Nubian faith, because when there was already a Christian sea around and the Egyptians themselves slowly began to forget the cults, then the troglodytes and the wild tribes that inhabited south of Egypt, but east of the world, in the eastern desert, they were great admirers of the great goddess, and even for a special tribute, they asked the local priest to bring the cult statue of the goddess to the shrine to illuminate the places where women give birth, so that the goddess would bless their inheritance. Phileas was the last temple moved in 1984 as a result of the famous Nubian campaign of UNESCO. All this was supposed to die, but the great Christian of Drushina Blecourt, the great French woman, rushed to the Egyptian president and to the French one. Accordingly, in Egypt it was Sadat. In Paris she rushed first even to the feet of de Gaulle, and then the second time to Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and then the great Nubian campaign of UNESCO was made. This is what the Temple of Phileas looked like after the British built the first dam in 1902. Usually only our Soviet dam, but the first temples were destroyed by the British because the water rose to the height of the pylons and all the polychrome painting on the columns inside the temples completely disappeared. And then the second threat was from the Soviet Swan. The rarest frame from the archive of Drushina Blecourt when it was presented is a kiosk of Troy on the island of Phileas, flooded with mineral water. And here You can see how the deposits of algae forever change the structure of the sandstone and limestone from which the columns of the temples in Odessa Sibuam, we were there today. This is the temple of Ramses II, flooded with sphinxes of the 13th century to the new era, and the rarest frame from the archive of Oleg Vitalyevich Kovtunovich, an outstanding Arabist, a friend of Evgeny Maximovich Primakov, and a person who was a personal translator. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev and Gamal Abdel Nasser during the discovery of the Aswan Dam. In the centre of Khrushchev, the tall figure of Gamal Abdel Nasser on the left is Kovtunovich himself, an outstanding scientist, author of remarkable books. Nina Petrovna Khrushcheva Kukarenko and her daughter Khrushcheva look at the gold of Tutankhamun, which hangs behind this sarcophagus. The 1960s became a critical milestone for Nubia because Nubia became a disappearing land. It became a legend, and the Nubians lost their homeland forever. Some of the Nubians from the flood zone were relocated to the modern-day Egyptian Kamombo, and some were moved to Sudan, to the modern Khartoum. The dream of the homeland, the lost homeland, the forgotten ancestors, the pain of the past, is a separate genre of modern Nubian literature. That is, it is a colossal cry of the people about their lost land. And of course, I can't help but show at least one frame from the history of relocation of Abu Simbel to a higher place, when the temple, according to the Swedish project, was cut down and relocated to a higher part of the rock. Not everyone was so lucky. On the island of Novaya Kalapsha, there is this yard which is rarely visited by tourists. There are few tourists there. This is a piece of the first yard of the Tay temple, which Ramses II built in the house of Hussein. The house of Hussein, which is now flooded, is a historical frame from the archives of the Chicago University of the 1920s. And what is on the left is a sketch of the great Scottish traveller David Roberts, whom everyone loves very much. Of all these colossi of the house of Hussein, which were painted, only one remained, which has now been restored. It was taken out and restored in the central atrium of the Nubian Museum in Aswan, an amazing museum. I highly recommend you to visit it, where, again, on very bright monuments, from the deep archaic of the 4th millennium BC to the 19th century. Egypt gave it to foreign friends, those who participated in the campaign to save the monuments of Nubia under the guidance of UNESCO. This is Dendur, which stands specially built for him in the wing of the Metropolitan Museum. This is not the worst option, because Dabot stands in Madrid under the open sky, often under the snow. And now, in the last 5 years, it was closed to tourists, and there is talk that the church is being destroyed. It can't stand the Spanish winter. Once all these churches stood on the banks of the Nubian Sea. El Alesia now stands inside the Turin Museum, Tafsa in Leiden. The gates of the church in Kalabsha stand inside one of the pavilions of the Berlin Museum. On the frames of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there are some amazing evidence of the existence of life on Earth, which were taken by foreign photographers in those days when they didn't work on archaeological excavations. Crocodiles were caught on the Nile. There are still crocodiles on the Nile. Now they live only beyond the Aswan Plateau, and you can see them further south. This is a special topic that will open to you. There is a lot of it on the internet. If you are interested, you can Google the 19th century Nubia. You will see a completely different, amazing land, only the pieces of the heritage that remain in the area of modern Aswan and Khartoum. I am finishing my story. I am here. This is Khartoum. This is a national museum. Yes, it doesn't look like an Egyptian museum in Cairo. Yes, there is no incredible architecture there, but even though the Americans, the British, and the Germans brought a lot of amazing monuments from there, a huge number of them were once kept in this museum. Let's see what remains of it. This is an interesting exhibition. Most of all, of course, it is about gold. Most likely there is no gold there, because among the monuments that have no analogues, there was this Nubian young king from the island of Argo, from the temple of the god Amun. He is bronze, all covered with gold. He has an amazing face. This is the thing that Sudan once defended and did not let be taken abroad, which was the pride of the Nubian National Archaeological Museum in Khartoum. Let's click and see what's left. At the bottom of the exposition, at the top, there are such pavilions. In such pavilions, I showed you the temple from the fortress in Bikini, the temple from the fortress in Semneh. This is a huge territory filled with unique evidence of the many millennia of existence of this land. It's amazing, but despite the Egyptian influence, Nubia was able to stay by itself. Thanks to the Egyptian influence, Nubia has gained forms, technologies, temple construction. These were people of incredible free will. And in the New Kingdom, the kings hired men from the Medjayev tribe because they had amazing physical strength, and they were policemen in the Egyptian court in the Avanian necropolis. The women of the Medjayev tribe cut off the long blue-black straight hair and gave them to the workshops. They made wigs out of them for the queen of the high priests. The relationship of Egypt and Nubia is a story of close relatives in which hatred and love constantly laughed at each other. But only when you start to study these monuments you understand how deeply these two lands grew into each other. And if, for obvious reasons, you don't have the opportunity to visit Sudan now, if you happen to be in Egypt, don't miss Aswan. Go to Aswan, see the Philae Island. Go to the Aswan Bazaar, which has incredible spices. The best spices in Egypt are in Aswan. There is the smell of tropical Africa. There are people there. You know, you go there and you see more light-skinned people, more dark-skinned people, and all of a sudden you see a face and a figure like a statue of a black tree with that bony face that goes up to these probably amazing tribes of Nubia, to the stories about the ancient pyramids and to the descendants of the great Kandaks.